Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspiring Change. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about a topic that's very topical, unfortunately, and it's a very sad topic, a very disturbing topic, and one that we as a society really need to tackle much more effectively. You probably guessed that what I'm talking about is domestic violence. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at what the root causes are behind it. It's a really complex topic, and people are, from looking at the media, they're looking for a sort of very simplistic approach or answer to it often. Although some people do recognize that this is a multi-layered issue that we really need to understand better and thereby put into place interventions, treatments, approaches that are going to begin to undo a very disturbing trend in our culture. And it's not just domestic violence, it's in fact violence of many kinds, and including bullying. So in this past week there were two pieces of news that really caught my eye and obviously the eye of many people. The first one was a 9-year-old boy who was being bullied. He's a boy that suffers or has dwarfism. And he was so badly bullied that essentially he wanted to kill himself. Now, alongside of that, found another article of a girl who actually did kill herself. And one of the things that she said prior to killing herself was that she didn't want any photos of her at her funeral because she was ugly. Now, the other news item that really disturbed pretty well anybody who saw this was a guy who incinerated his family in the car. He doused them with petrol. So that was his wife and his 3 children. And all I can say as a parent, as a father, as a grandfather, is that this is horrendous. Now, he's not alone in killing the ones he professes to love. It's actually quite common. Unfortunately, too common. And so one of the things that I want to talk through is a presentation that I gave last year at a domestic violence conference, Stop Domestic Violence. And the topic that I chose is about the root cause, and I call it Deconstructing Patriarchy. It's men's business. So one of the things that I opened with in that particular presentation was that a couple of years ago on ABC's Q&A, Germaine Greer and a renowned writer and former psychiatrist, Theodore Dalrymple, were in a discussion panel. And I watched this with great interest. And it was interesting to see two authorities clash over the causes of domestic violence. And that was Germaine Greer's position as a feminist, that essentially it's cultural, and Dalrymple's position was that it's essentially a consequence of jealousy. It's and he quite rightly observed that extreme jealousy was often behind domestic violence. And having worked with domestic violence perpetrator, I can certainly say that. Now, the issue is that it became a sort of either-or debate. And again, whenever we reduce discussions of this nature to such a simplistic level, I get really uncomfortable. And Germaine Greer's position, and she quickly countered with, I probably would have thought that actually what drives domestic violence is misogyny, the actual dislike of women and not respecting them. So it's an interesting position. So on one hand, we've got someone arguing that it's dispositional. Germaine Greer also talks about it as a dispositional issue, but neither really brought up the social, the contextual issue, nor the systemic issue. So they appear on the surface to be quite different, but in fact, there's a great deal of overlap with both positions. And I'll come back to this thing, what makes someone beat the one you claim to love? Now, unfortunately, the discussion didn't go a great deal further. And my argument is that what we didn't get is addressing domestic violence and related issues from a deeper examination of what causes jealousy, and similarly what causes misogyny and a deep respect for women. But let's take it another step further. What about the 9-year-old boy with dwarfism? Why was he subjected to emotional violence? And potentially, I suspect, also physical violence. I've seen, and I work with lots and lots of boys who get bullied, and it doesn't stop at emotional bullying, emotional violence. It continues often into physical violence, either one-on-one or a group-on-one. So one person is singled out and targeted. Now, my argument here is why am I talking about patriarchy? So let me refresh your thinking on this. If I'm going to do a root cause analysis, I actually have to arrive at the point that we have a deep-seated connection to an ideology that promotes and edifies violence of all sorts of kinds, in sport, in corporate competition, in education, but it's very, very subtle. So again, let me describe patriarchy as a system that promotes being territorial, promotes status, so you have to essentially be of a particular social background, level, and appearance. A lot of the bullying around with girls is about their appearance. It's also now started to include boys, and we have this issue where people talk about the alpha male, and to me that's rubbish. Fundamentally, that whole notion about alpha anything is actually quite flawed. It might maybe apply to wolves in captivity, but even when we look at wolves' behaviour in nature, it doesn't hold true. So the other part of it is that men and women are socialised in the patriarchal context to be also acquisitional and competitive. So in that whole process of thinking about the other, we objectify people and they become often a status symbol. And we become possessive over that status symbol. And in men's culture, we often talk about trophy wives, okay? Now, that's really relevant when we look at, high-performing sports people, especially in areas like rugby, cricket, where a lot of attention is paid to the attractiveness and, the qualities of the wives, the girlfriends. And so, inherently we're talking about these women giving men a higher level of status. This is a very dangerous platform to deal with. So despite the gender revolution, or supposed gender revolution over the last 50 years, a significant number of men and women continue to cling desperately to patriarchal values, these attitudes and behaviours that are really quite toxic. And it's from those toxic attitudes and beliefs that we need to start looking at the consequences, in which case it's, emotional and physical violence towards another person or persons. Patriarchy is deeply embedded in our society and in our institutions. Men continue to respond and shape our psychological and social landscape according to traditional stereotypes. Now, if we can't compete well, one of the things that happens for us as men is we do become combative. We get and draw into combat, into violence to get what it is that we want. So my argument in this whole presentation is essentially, as long as we indoctrinate boys and girls into patriarchal values, we're going to see, firstly, an us versus them, a certain level of snobbery about who is attractive, who is socially desirable, who's sexually desirable. And if we don't feel like we're competing, i.e. my girlfriend or wife is going to go off with somebody else, we treat that person as a possession, and it becomes an issue of ownership. And so I'm going to defend my territory, and all that I believe belongs in that territory, and that includes women and children. So if I can't have them, no one else will. And some men in that context will resort to harming and killing those they profess to love. It is an extraordinarily disturbing effect. Now, part of it is that in men's culture, we don't start at the beginning in terms of, what is it that gets men, individual men, along this pathway. Part of it is that, in my experience, a significant number of men that I've worked with who've been violent in relationships actually have serious attachment disorders. Something in their childhood, set up a level of disconnect. And one of the things that happens with that is an increase in anxiety. So jealousy, in part, is a state of heightened anxiety that can escalate very quickly. And the other part of it is that they have difficulty regulating their emotions. Now, if you've got a sport and if you participate at a high level of a sport that is inherently a contact sport, that is violent in itself, the capacity for those men to really regulate their behaviour, including their impulsivity and their acting out, i.e. aggressively and violently, is reduced. They don't have those skills necessarily. And one of the things that we do in our culture is we often excuse the low end of that behaviour because it's on a spectrum that escalates. Oh, boys will be boys. And that is one of the most damaging observations that I see in raising boys. And it's also damaging for girls who believe that this is part of boys and men's nature. And we need to really think about, firstly, how we parent, how we educate, and how we monitor. So why did I call this about men's business? Because it's us as men. Because not all men follow that path, it's us as men who need to provide the role models, the checks, and the balances with our peers and peers above and below, where we go, you know what? When you did this, your behaviour is out of line. You need to check that. Now, men are often a lot more responsive to other men calling them on their behaviour. When women do it, women are often relegated into, she's a feminazi, she's a bitch, she's a this, and we don't take notice of it, of her. And I've seen this time and time again. There's this huge backlash in our culture right now against the idea that women should be treated as equals. It's very, very disturbing. Now, if you don't have a sense that your wife, your girlfriend, is your equal, you're actually disrespecting them. And at that point, I, as a man who doesn't hold those values, have a responsibility and a right to call that person on their behaviour. And as a therapist, I will do that. Now, the question is, what about those of us who aren't therapists, who aren't counsellors? Are we going to call other men on their behaviour? Are we going to really get them to take a hard look at themselves. Now, I really do believe, and Stephen Biloff has also written about this, that in many respects we need a curriculum, and I talk about a curriculum in Making Good Men Great, of helping men to deconstruct patriarchal socialisation, to allow men to be part of groups of men wherein we hold ourselves accountable for our ideas, attitude, beliefs and behaviours that are detrimental, that are toxic towards others, especially the ones that we love. We need to have an education system that's overhauled, that does not glorify competition and combat the way that it does. We need to take a look at what happens politically. We need to take a look at what happens in organisational and corporate life, where, we have people excuse, violence towards others. And that also includes sexual violence. And grooming children is a form of sexual violence. And those people who excuse, are apologetic for perpetrators, are part of the problem. So the question I'm going to throw out there is, you need to think as a man whether you're part of the solution, whether you're part of stopping this toxin, this poison in our society, in our culture, or you part of the problem. Because if you are part of the problem, it's time that you actually step back and really focus on changing yourself, whether that's, you've got a problem with managing your anger, whether you are aggressive in business, and whether you disenfranchise others, i.e., calling people on their race, on their ethnicity, on their religion. All of those things form the foundation for a systemic and individual level of violence. Now, unfortunately, we have conservative politicians in place who are using exactly those strategies for political power. And it's about not just power, it's about control. And it's this unconscionable. We need leadership who does exactly the opposite, who subscribes to fundamental values and beliefs that are inclusive, that are respectful, that encourages sharing of resources and emotion and relationships, and that is about cooperating with each other to create a society that has a much, much more clearly defined vision of love, of kindness, of tolerance. And if you're not part of that program, you're part of the problem. And I'm going to call it really straight, because I get very angry when I watch these shock jocks sprout utter poison into our community, and who should not be given that sort of airplay. And yes, people talk about we have freedom of speech. And there is a part where I go, at least I know where they're coming from so we can tackle that. But at the same time, I go, you've got to really take ownership and reflect on the lack of character and morality that you hold up as a model to others, especially young men and young women who are highly influential. They're easily influenced through the power and the position that these shock jocks have. People grab onto that stuff, and it is toxic. Our culture is suffering. Our community is suffering. And it has to stop. And in a way, we need to start somewhere. So we need to focus on men stopping to kill women. And if someone raises the issue about what about women harming men, the statistics are in. That it's so disproportional that it's, not even worth talking about at this point. Yes, there are occasions, and I work with a lot of men who are in emotionally toxic relationships where women are, emotionally and sometimes physically aggressive and violent. But that's not helpful. We need to take ownership for our own part in the problem as well as our part in the solution. We need to stop looking across the fence and start putting our own house in order. So, yep, it's a heavy topic, but we can't avoid it. As in therapy, as in social change, we need to have meaningful conversations about the stuff that's really disturbing, distressing, and toxic. And it starts within the house. I'm going to put my house in order, and then I'm going to hold other men who are inappropriate to account. Okay, on that note, I'll finish. Some really serious food for thought, especially for the guys. You really need to make a decision about where you stand. And it's about us as men taking up the business of change.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspired Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.